Folkolinos. Welcome to Fabric of Folklore, the podcast where we unravel the mysteries of folklore. I'm your host, Vanessa Y. Rogers, and one reason I started this podcast was to better understand the meaning behind folklore, the history behind the stories, and today our guest will be doing just that with the oldest documented ghost story in the United States. Michelle Shores grew up in Maine and has been actively involved with genealogy and local history for over 35 years. She's the author of a gripping new book called The Gathering Room, A Tale of Nellie Butler. And it's based on a true story. It is an epic retelling of a piece of Maine folklore. She's been giving talks at historical societies and libraries because of the historical relevance of this story. So thank you so much, Michelle, for coming on. I'm really excited about today's talk.
Oh, well, thank you, Vanessa. I look forward to the opportunity to share this exciting story with a lot of people.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's get started. Can you tell us a little bit just about yourself prior to the book, like what kind of led up to the book?
Sure. So I have been a historian and a genealogical researcher for the majority of my adult life. And I tend to gravitate towards historical books, nonfiction books. I don't generally read fiction. I want to know the whys behind the reason why things happen. In 2015, I found myself looking for something to read for Halloween. And I wandered into a bookstore, and sadly, to this day, I cannot remember which bookstore it was, but I wandered in and I went directly to the nonfiction section because those are the books I tend to read. And I found a book called The Documentary History of the Nellie Butler Hauntings, published by the University of Maine Press and done by Mark Labrizzi. And what it ended up being was the transcription of the historical records of a sighting of a ghost in the area that would become Sullivan or Franklin, Maine in 1799 and 1800. And I read the entire book that night. I couldn't put it down. Well, I have it right here.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
If anyone's interested, it is the actual history. And so the very next morning I woke up and I did what all good researchers and historians do. And I jumped right on my computer and I researched because although that book shows the moment that the ghost appeared and dropped into the historical record, there is no backstory of how the people that were involved in the sighting of the ghost actually came to be there. And I wanted to know how they found themselves in that situation, what they felt, what were their emotions, what did they think? And of course, those things don't generally exist in historical records. So after about 3 weeks, I woke up one night in the middle of the night and I said, I'll just write what I think happened. And so that's what I did. And I ultimately started this journey writing it for my own entertainment. I was so obsessed with this story, it just consumed my inner being and I needed to get it out. So initially, that is what started it.
What do you
then
think?
People would see me. Go ahead.
What do you think? Was it that really made you obsessed, like you were saying, or drew you to the story?
The people involved. This ghost appeared to direct other people's lives. I mean, that was her whole purpose for showing up. Was she wanted to make something happen. And you generally don't see that in a ghost. Usually ghosts just show up and, they talk about how they're stuck between this world and the next, or they need to get back, or they wish they could have done this. But this particular ghost had a purpose. And I think for me, for writing the backstory, I needed to lay the foundation of why that ghost had that particular purpose in mind.
Okay, so let's give our audience, can you go into storytelling mode and tell us the documented version of the ghost story? And you can take as long as you need because this is a storytelling podcast as well. So we enjoy stories.
Oh, wonderful. Well, and I want to be able to tell the story without giving away too much of the book either.
Okay.
So the ghost is the ghost of Nellie Butler. She was the wife of Captain George Butler. and she died in childbirth. A few years after she died, her ghost appeared in the home of another family in town, not related to George in any way. And when she appeared, she instructed those that were listening to her that George needed to marry Lydia Blaisdell, who was the young lady that lived in that house where she was appearing. And so the turmoil that it caused within the community of Franklin and Sullivan was because George and the Butlers were a relatively well-to-do, financially stable family. The Blaisdells, not so much. So the feeling at the time was that this was a hoax. The Blaisdells were perpetrating this hoax to try to get their daughter married off to Captain Butler. Mm-hmm. About half the town thought that. Mm-hmm. The other half of the town thought this was a true spiritual manifestation. Mm-hmm. When the ghost appeared, she spoke rather cryptically, but she always referenced some kind of Christian religion, culture, or things that someone in that particular religion would have felt comfortable with and would have assumed were coming from God, even though she was very cryptic. So you had the religious people in the community feeling that this was of God, that this is what God was instructing, was for George to marry Lydia. Then you had poor George and Lydia, stuck in the middle of this. And then that's the piece that was missing out of the historical record is, what did George feel? What did Lydia feel? When I first started this, I thought I was writing the story of Nellie Butler. But after it was finished, I realized Nellie's story as a ghost has been told over and over again. Mm. I ultimately ended up writing George and Lydia's story and how they experienced all of this.
So you talk about how she was cryptic. In what way was she cryptic?
When the ghost would appear, the first thing she would always say is, I was once Nellie Hooper. I died as Nellie Butler. Cryptic things like that. I come as one who speaks from the wilderness. Mm-hmm. Just kind of random. She didn't just pop in and go, "Hey, George, it's Nellie. Mm-hmm. I think you should marry Lydia." Those kind of things. She spoke rather cryptically and in odd ways, even for that time period. I mean, obviously, when we read historical records, we find that they speak differently than we do, but she spoke even cryptically as well.
And did the community and during that time really believe in ghosts? Because I know that there are some religions that really incorporate ghost belief, and then there are some that don't. So was this particular community one that was already ghost believing?
Well, I think anywhere along the coast of Maine during that time, you're going to find some kind of belief in something of the spiritual, supernatural, other spiritual realms and of that nature. This was long after anything that would have been considered a witch trial, although the word was batted around a couple times in reference to Lydia. Was she conjuring up this spirit because she was a witch? Mm-hmm. Was she conjuring up this spirit because she had, at the time they used the phrase, a familiar spirit, which would basically what we would be considered as a possession nowadays. Mm-hmm. But I think mostly during that time period, a lot of people had beliefs in something of the supernatural, even if they were strongly religious.
And what about the church? Did the church have did they support belief in spirits, the spiritual world, or?
Well, that's where we run in. That's how we actually end up into the historical record. I tell people when I meet with them about the book is, this is considered the first documented ghost sighting in America. Now, I'm sure people have been sitting around the campfire for a millennial talking about the shadow they saw when they headed to their cave the other night. Ghost stories themselves are not new. This one dropped into the historical record because basically of the church. So 20 years after the ghost appeared, Lydia's father filed a what we would consider a civil complaint, but he filed the complaint within the religious organization, within the church in that community. And he filed this complaint against George for burning Lydia's possessions. And that's what caused such a turmoil. That's what caused everybody to have to give a testimony and deposition of what they had seen and why George burned Lydia's possessions in the first place. He burned Lydia's possessions because of this ghost. So an official from the church actually traveled to Franklin and spoke with everyone and recorded all of the testimonies of the people that had seen the ghost to try to settle this complaint that was filed by Lydia's father.
And what did the official come away with? Did he,
No.
were the testimonies similar? Did they, did they hear the same type of thing from Lydia?
Yeah. So the testimonies that were taken from George, and then Nellie's sister, Nellie's father, George's parents, other people in the town, anyone who had seen the ghost. And you have to remember, at one point, over 100 people had seen this ghost. They had also seen this ghost walk over a mile in broad daylight. So this was something that a lot of people had witnessed. And so there were a lot of testimonies. And again, it all went back to almost a complete 50-50 split, where half of them thought it was a hoax, the tricks of light, some kind of weirdness going on that they couldn't explain. And then, and then others thought it was real.
So the ghost appeared in different places?
Yes. Yeah. Primarily it appeared in the home of the Blaisdells. And in the actual historical record, the ghost appeared in the basement of the Blaisdells' home. But when I was writing it, I've been inside a dirt floor, hand dug basement in an old home on the coast of Maine. And it didn't fit what I saw in my mind and I wanted to write. So I actually moved the ghost to appearing in a room in the Blaisdells' house. But either way, the ghost appeared in the Blaisdells' home until one day she decided she needed to go out and walk so that people would see her outside of the Blaisdells' home, so that they would stop associating her with Lydia. The ghost was very clear that she was there on a mission from God to orchestrate this marriage between George and Lydia. And I think she realized she needed to come out of the basement and move amongst the people and let other people see her. So she did. It's recorded that she walked across an open field in broad daylight for almost a mile, and with a trail of people behind her.
Oh, wow. So did they listen to her? Did they get married in the end?
Yes, they did. They did get married.
Oh, yes. Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, it doesn't end well. So.
Oh, how so? What happened?
Well, short of giving away the whole story, but I suppose anybody can find it on Google. After George consented to marrying Lydia, and they were married, the ghost appeared one more time. And in her final appearance to George, she told him that Lydia would die the same way that she died, which was in childbirth. And Lydia did. Within 9 months, Lydia died from childbirth. The piece of this in the historically accurate, in the record, in what really happened, that I find so interesting is that George went on to marry for a third time. And his third wife had 11 children. Now, if you have married once and lost the love of your life, your very first wife, if you've lost her to childbirth, and then you're forced to marry someone else that you're not particularly fond of because of a ghost, and then you lose her in childbirth, I think I'd be a little leery about marrying for that third time, let alone when she came to you and told you she was pregnant. I would find that very difficult. So I think that's part of what I wrote into the story is I think what's been lost in the history is what did George go through? How did he feel about all of this, and what turmoil did he go through? Because like I said, it was 20 years after Lydia's death that her father came and filed these charges against him and dragged this whole thing up all over again.
Wow.
So there was no end to this for George.
Yeah.
It followed him his entire life. Yeah.
So as a historian, how do you research a story like this? I mean, obviously there's a lot of information online, but did you find any journals of the particular people that you're researching? Where do you go? What do you do?
Well, my primary source obviously was the book by Marcus Labrizzi. He did an amazing job. What we found, or what I found later as we went through this whole process, is that the area that became Sullivan and Franklin tried to bury this. It was such a traumatic event for the community that they really tried to bury it. And 100 years after the fact, so in the early 1900s, another historian found this and dragged it up and started snooping around and went to the town and, do you know anything about this? And the town literally said, oh, no, that didn't happen here. That happened over in Machiasport. They lived in Machiasport. They didn't live here. So sometimes if you Google the Nellie Butler haunting, or if you Google Abner Blaisdell or something of that nature, you will find it states that it happened in Machiasport. It didn't. That was fake news.
Fake news early.
The interesting part was when Marcus Labrizzi from the University of Maine started doing this research into this ghost story. He was the one that was finally able to uncover that it had happened in Sullivan. And it had the Butlers. I keep saying Sullivan and Franklin, and for those that aren't familiar with the coast of Maine, there's a bay called Taunton Bay, and Sullivan is on one side of it and Franklin is on the other, but it's a very narrow bay. And the Butlers lived in what became Franklin, and the Blaisdells lived in what became Sullivan. So it encompasses that whole area right around the bay.
Okay.
And so Marcus's work really brought it back to Sullivan.
When did he
I've
write?
been to Sullivan.
When did he write the book?
Let's look, shall we? 2010.
Okay. Now, you said it was traumatic for the town. I would imagine why it would be traumatic for George and Lydia's family and Nellie's family, but what about the rest of the town? Why would it be traumatic for them?
Well, you have to envision, again, this is a small coastal community in the late 18th century, early 19th century. They're all interrelated in a lot of ways. Their children marry each other, or they've come from other families from other parts of Massachusetts and emigrated up to Maine, and they have a history of being related. Or in the case for these individuals, George's father, Moses Butler, Lydia's father, Abner Blaisdell, and Nellie's father, David Hooper, had all fought in the Revolutionary War together. And they had all come from an area of southern Maine around York and Saco. And they had immigrated to the area that would become Sullivan and Franklin after the Revolutionary War. And they came there to start a new community. So they were
the founders.
They were the founders, exactly. And when you're working together in a situation like that, and you go off into the wilderness to start a new community, you're all very interconnected in multiple ways. So when something this traumatic takes place, it tends to rip apart all of those threads that hold a community together, especially with it being so divided between those that thought it was a hoax and those that thought it were real.
Now, you said they tried to bury it. Did they do anything else besides just lie that it didn't actually happen to their town? Or did they find the records and try and dispose of them? Or what did they do?
No, I don't believe the records were disposed of, because Marcus was able to find them in 2010. And I actually spoke up at the Sullivan Historical Society back in December, and the director of the Historical Society there has quite a few records. So the records still exist. They were just buried and nobody talked about it. I mean, that's pretty typical for New England. You don't like something, you just don't talk about it and you move on.
How did that talk go, since it was very relevant to that area? Did you get really interesting questions or in-depth questions?
It was really interesting. The initial invite came from the Historical Society, but it took a while. The talk was in conjunction with the library, and there was a lot of discussion amongst themselves whether I should even come, because my book is historical fiction, and several of them said that no, it's fiction. It's not really what happened. But the director of the Historical Society was very adamant that yes, my book is fiction, but it is shining a light on their history. And she felt that that was important for people to see. So one of the first comments that I got was from a wonderful lady. She came up to me. She says, "I read your book." And I said, "Oh, well, thank you." She said, "It was good." And I said, "Oh, good. I'm glad you liked it." She goes, "But it's not true." And I said, "No, I know it's not true." I know it's not. And she says, "I was reading it and I was going, well, no, that's not true. Well, that's not true." And I said, "It's okay. I'm not trying to say that it is true. I tell everyone it's historical fiction." But it was a wonderful time. They were wonderful people. I enjoyed being there. I think this is surprising to them that this book has taken off to the extent that it has, because it has. There was a woman who lives across the street from the cemetery, and she came to me and she said, "I was wondering why I kept seeing so many cars go into the cemetery." She says, "They're stopping at George's grave." And I said, "Yes, they are." And the bigger that this gets and the more people that become aware of this story, you might need, I said, you might want to talk about this amongst yourselves. Like maybe we should put up a sign that directs people right to where his gravestone is. Otherwise you're going to have people traipsing all over the yard looking for it.
Sounds like an opportunity for the Historical Society, to have some sort of tour set up for, added tourism to their city.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you got to remember too, it's small town Maine. It's a very small community.
So how small are we talking?
Without checking, and I don't want the people in the area to get upset with me. I don't know, a couple thousand.
Okay.
It's small. Yeah, it's small. I happened to be in the area one day, and I had a shipment of books that needed to be mailed out, and I thought it was really cool if I went to the post office and I had them post stamped that said Franklin, Maine. I thought that would be really cool for those readers that were getting those books. So I went into the post office and told the lady what I was doing, and it was obvious these books were being sent out all over the country. And she looked at me and she goes, "Does that mean a lot of people are going to start coming here?" And I said, "Maybe, it just might."
Was she happy or sad about this prospect?
I don't know. She had a pretty good poker face on. But, I'm going back there this summer. I'm speaking at two local businesses are doing a joint event in the middle of the summer when more tourists will be there. And I'm going to be speaking then. So I'm really looking forward to it. They're wonderful people down there, and they have this amazing history. And I just feel very blessed and thankful that I'm able to be able to share a little bit of it.
Well, what other history do they have that is amazing? What's special about that area besides this ghost story?
It's the coast of Maine. Just a little further up in Machias, as we mentioned earlier, the first naval battle for the Revolutionary War was fought there.
Oh, okay.
Castine, which is also just a little bit off the coast there, is one of the earliest settled areas of the coast. They were first settled by, the French, and they built a fort. So the entire coast of Maine has quite a bit of history, but this little piece in Sullivan and Franklin is quite intriguing.
Did the French Indian War also occur in the Maine area?
Oh, yes. Yeah. We suffered from that just like everywhere else. And in fact, in quite a ways, it stopped the settlement for a number of years. Some of spots of Maine were settled as early as the 1600s. And then when the French and Indian Wars started, people pulled back and then didn't go back into other areas until that was finished.
So it was first settled by the French?
Oh, the Castine area, yeah. Castine and that area were first settled by French.
And so do you see remnants of that in the architecture or any culinary? What do you see, today, anything from the French still existing?
Well, I mean, you go anywhere near northern Maine and they still speak French up there. So.
Do they?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I didn't realize that.
A lot of people still speak French. Maine has a wonderful Franco-American heritage that I won't speak to because I have very little knowledge of it, but I would definitely recommend anyone that is interested in Maine's Franco-American heritage. There's a wonderful museum in Lewiston. In addition to Castine itself has an amazing historical society there, and they can fill in all the holes that I am not able to do.
Wow, that is really interesting. I'm in Texas, and we have a lot of German heritage here, and there are several German towns. I'm in San Antonio, and around the San Antonio area, there are several towns that a couple of them have German newspapers still, but there's not a lot of German speaking people anymore. There's a few, but I think it's really just for the historical elements.
Yeah.
So in your research, was there anything in particular that surprised you or you weren't expecting?
I guess the biggest thing was when I realized that George married for a third time and had 11 children. That just would have been the biggest shock for me. As far as writing the book, the ending in the historical record, which I think I referenced earlier, was George burning all of Lydia's possessions. In the historical record, he did that by putting all of her possessions in a boat or a raft. And he lit them on fire and he pushed it out into the bay, and it was caught by the outgoing tide, and it took this burning boat all the way down the bay so that everyone saw it, almost as if he was trying to make a statement. He'd had enough of this whole thing. When I read that in the historical record, my original plan was to end my book that way. I mean, I thought that was cool. I mean, how much more cool can you get than that? But as I was writing the book, and I've said this several times, the book in a different direction. It wrote the ending in a different direction as well. And so the ending of my book is not historically accurate totally. It is close, but it ends in a much more dramatic fashion.
Interesting. So you think that he did that just to wipe his hands clean with it? He didn't want to talk about it anymore. He didn't want to. I mean, because to me that seems like it would be attention grabbing. Like if everyone can see this, then.
Yeah, but you also have to go back to remember that the whole reason why he married Lydia was based on the appearance of this spirit, this ghost, this specter. George heard the stories from the other people as well. Was she possessed of the devil? Had she sold herself to the devil to secure a marriage to George? I think at that point, George must have been under a tremendous amount of mental anguish. And maybe you got to remember too, they were oftentimes a lot more religious minded than we would be. And he may have felt in burning all of her possessions, he was performing some kind of an exorcism or something, I mean, we don't totally understand the reasoning behind why he did it. He just felt that he needed to burn everything that had belonged to her.
How interesting.
I know.
So you've done several talks at historical societies and libraries. Are there any elements that you talk about in your talks that we haven't covered in this segment?
No, a lot of times when I get there, and I recently spoke at the Eastern Maine Community College as well, and I'm in the coming weeks I've got talks scheduled at local high schools as well. So cool. I talk a lot about I know it's an amazing story. I talk a lot about the history that we do, and then a lot of times I will ask people who are present who have read it, what did you think was real? What did you think was fiction? And I always find that very fascinating. Everyone tells me my book reads incredibly believable. They believe all of it, and I have to remind them that it is based on an actual event, but you have to remember it's fiction. But it's fun to hear what they think is real and what's not.
Yeah. Well, I wish I could ask you, but I haven't read the book yet, so I am excited to read it. So, in the back of the book, I in a lot of historical fiction books, there's like a section where people will say, these are the elements that I, embellished on, and these are the elements that were based in actual historical documentation. Do you do that a little bit in the back?
Yes, because I too love to read historical fiction, and I want to know what's real and what's not, because I'm all about what's real. So I do have an author's note in the back that does explain to you the parts that are real and the parts that I embellish, the characters that are real. Several of the characters in the book are actually my own ancestors that I injected into the storyline because they lived in the area. So I was like, oh, it might have been there. So, I threw them in. So in the back of the book, and I also do make reference to the fact that we have to remember these were real people. So even though Nellie died young and Lydia died young, George went on to have 11 children, and then they had children and they had children and they had children. So there are people alive today who are connected, to this story. And I mentioned in my author's note that I hope that I have done it justice. The history is what the history is. Lydia and the Blaisdells were not viewed in a, particularly favorable light because of this. No reflection on the Blaisdell family as a whole. They're a very fascinating family. They've done a lot of amazing things. They settled multiple communities across the coast of Maine and New Hampshire and down into Massachusetts. But this particular family, Abner Blaisdell's family, was associated with this ghost, was associated with the turmoil it caused in the town. And unfortunately, not everyone sits on the right side of history all the time.
Have you had any contact with any of the descendants from anyone from this story?
Yeah, so when I spoke at the Sullivan Historical Society, there was a woman there who was a Butler descendant, and she had read the book, and she was very pleased with it. She told me there's a place in the bay that juts out that's called Butlers Point. And she was telling me different geographical attributes to Butlers Point. And because it's a private road, you can't get down there, now. But she was telling me about the point and how beautiful it is. And so that was cool.
Good. So as a historian, you're looking for the why when you're reading things, and possibly the deeper meanings of the story. Do you think that there are any deeper meanings to this particular story, either then or even in today's society?
I don't know. And Marcus does a really good job in his nonfiction book of explaining that this was never settled. It was never satisfied. There was research that was done in regards to wondering if maybe there was like a mass hysteria moment, which was common, like in the witch trials in Salem and things. There was also a question of whether this could have been something along the lines of a mass poisoning or a bacterial kind of virus thing in that area. I mean, Marcus does a really good job of touching on all the potential reasonings for why, scientific reasonings for why this could have happened. And there's no explanation. There isn't. And it was never settled. It was never, ever settled. Was Lydia some kind of a medium that attracted this spirit? Was she a witch? Was she possessed? It was never, ever settled. So I tried to leave that in writing my book. I tried to leave that ambiguity there. That there is no answer to this for why.
Interesting. So do you feel like in Maine, it is a significant story? Does it permeate the culture in any way?
That was the fascinating thing. I've been studying Maine history, like I said, for the majority of my adult life. I had never heard of it. And even when I went to Franklin to mail out those books that day, I told the lady at the post office, I said, I've written a book about, the ghost here in Franklin. And she says, oh, Catherine Hill? And I'm like, who's Catherine Hill? I don't know.
Your next book.
And I said, no, Nellie Butler. And she goes, who's that? So even living right there in town, she didn't know. So, history is full of so many things. And there really was an attempt to bury this story completely. So I think that's why a lot of people don't know about it.
But they're finding out.
They're finding out now, let me tell you.
Does the story have any significance to you in particular? Does it have any meaning for you?
This journey that I have been on since 2015 with this story has changed my life. And I often will say to my husband or to my friends, I don't know why I was chosen. I don't. I have no connection to this family. Like I said, my ancestors were in the area, but a lot of people's ancestors were in the area. But this story took hold of me. And a lot of times I feel like this book in particular is on a journey of its own. And it has a plan. And I am just along for the ride. It's the most amazing thing I've ever seen. Truly, truly the most amazing thing I've ever seen.
Because you've written books before, right? You were a published author, and you haven't had this experience with other books.
No. My other books were nonfiction. This was my first foray into fiction, which I found is a completely different animal. When you write nonfiction, you're putting together stats and data, and your world is very point A to point B to point B. When you're doing fiction, it's more like creating a painting. It's an artist's rendering, and you feel like you're putting a piece of yourself out there for the whole world to judge.
That's very true. Yeah. Well, I personally love historical fiction, partially for what you're explaining, because it really paints the picture in a more palatable light. Whereas when you're reading a nonfiction book, sometimes it can be dry. Even though authors often really try hard to, make it come to life, adding, flesh to it that you can actually find from historical documents is super helpful in picturing it in someone's mind. So even though there might be elements of your book that are not true, I still feel like that it's really helpful in helping people connect with history in a deeper and more significant way.
Oh, absolutely. One of the biggest forms of feedback I get about my book is that as people are reading the story, that it's very visual. They can actually feel like they are right there. So somehow I was able to write that in a way to create that experience for them. And it brings that time period to life for them. And that's important, I think, in understanding a history of any area, but particularly this. If you're going to try to understand what happened here, it's very, very helpful that you feel like you're actually in the moment.
Actually I have a question about that, because when you're writing historical fiction, you don't just write about the people. You have to talk about, the details, like what they dressed, what their mannerisms were. Their language was different, even though they're speaking our language, but they speak in different ways. How do you research that? Where do you find the information to, fill that in?
Yeah. So the language piece of it wasn't difficult for me because I am a historian. So I read a lot of really old books, like really old books. And sometimes when I'm talking, I remember when my kids were growing up, I would talk and say things in this. And I remember my daughter saying, "Mom, people don't talk like that anymore. Stop it." So that piece of it, understanding how people spoke to each other and the words that they would have said, that wasn't difficult. But I will tell you, I knew as I started this, I knew George and Nellie had to get married. Obviously, they had to get married in order for her to become pregnant and to die. So I knew I had to write 18th, 19th century wedding in New England. I knew nothing about that. So you go to good old Google and you Google, 19th century New England wedding customs. And then you just start finding all of this stuff. And I was like, well, this is cool. And one of the things that I found was something called a posset ring. So in our weddings nowadays, the bride will toss the bouquet to find out who's going to get married next. Back then, they used to put a little silver ring into the posset, which was a drink. And whoever ended up with that ring in their cup would then be the next one to marry. I thought, well, this is adorable. I shall just throw that in there and make myself look smart, right? So, so I write that into the story, and then again, the story wrote itself. The ring actually ends up becoming central and key to my whole story. I'm not going to give it away, but but the ring ends up going through the whole story. And a lot of people, when I speak, they'll ask me that. Oh my gosh! So what happened to the ring? Right? Where did the ring go? And I'm like, well, the ring was fiction. And they're like, what? Yeah, it was fiction. Sorry.
How fascinating. Well, you never know if it was actually, it could have actually been true. You just don't know. It wasn't historically documented in their story.
And in some ways, I wonder, and I did write this into the story, with there being so much turmoil around George marrying Lydia, because of the ghost and because of the differences in their families and things, I sometimes believe that I don't think the wedding was a big deal. I don't think there was a church full of people and Lydia walked in a gown and, there was all this. I think the marriage of George and Lydia was probably extremely low key and not necessarily a celebration of any kind.
Mm-hmm. Like they wouldn't have wanted to draw attention to it. Right.
Mm-hmm. Because it was a very difficult thing for George to have to do. Very difficult.
So what are some of the best questions you've been asked at one of your talks?
The ring. They asked me about the ring, but I think the most amazing thing that happened to me is I was doing a reading, and I was just reading, a couple paragraphs, a chapter. I don't remember now exactly what it was I was reading. But I looked up, and a woman sitting in the front row was just, the only word that came to my mind was mesmerized. She was absolutely mesmerized. She was hanging on every word I was saying. And I could see in her face that she was no longer sitting in that room. Yeah. She was on Butlers Point. She literally was on Butlers Point. And for me at that moment, I was like, I got it. I did what I set out to do. And I'm just incredibly blessed to be part of this. It's the most amazing thing I have ever experienced. Truly.
So where can people find your book?
So my book is available on Amazon. You can order the paperback copy. It is also available as a Kindle download. And if you have Kindle Unlimited, it's free. So you can read it there. If you would like a signed copy, I ask people to order it from my website, which is mshoreswriter.com. And I will happily sign it and mail it off to you. The price is exactly the same between Amazon and my website. There's no extra charge for the signature, but I will send out signed copies that way.
How awesome! So what's next for you?
I am headed to England in a couple of weeks, and I am starting a research trip on the next book. I'm not giving much away just yet on what it is, but I will tell you it is supernatural, and it starts in England and it ends on the coast of Maine. And
is it going to be another historical fiction, or?
Yep, it is also a historical fiction. It predates The Gathering Room by 100 years or so. We're looking at the 1600s now rather than the 17 and 1800s. So very, very fascinating piece of Maine history that I stumbled upon. Again, another little known piece. Came across another book, nonfiction book written, and went, oh, I did not know this. So I'm going to take that one and run with it now and see where it takes me.
How fun. Well, I'm very excited for your journey, and thanks so much for coming on. Is there anything else that you feel like we've missed or we haven't covered?
No, I think you did a great job. I really appreciate this opportunity to tell people about the story and to try to get this information out for people as much as they want it, because that's one of the things I found. People love a ghost story. It doesn't matter where. Yeah. I have sent books to every state in this country. I have shipped books to the UK and to Canada. So it does not matter where people live. This is not just a Maine story. This is a true ghost story that is absolutely fascinating.
Well, we'll definitely add all your links to our page. Do you happen to have a map of that bay? Maybe we could add that to our show notes.
Sure. The map, actually, again, as we talked earlier about what we like reading when we read historical fiction, I like a map so I can picture it. And so I hired an illustrator, and she drew a beautiful map of the bay, and it is in the front of the book. Okay. So while you're reading the book, you can follow along around the bay where everybody went and enjoy seeing it.
Well, thanks so much. And thank you, Folkolinos, for joining us on our folky journey today. If you want to learn more about the book, like I said, it'll be on our website, www.fabricoffolklore.com. And please share with us what you thought of the show on our Facebook group. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share wherever you're watching, either on YouTube or if you're just listening on your podcast streaming. And even if you are just sharing with people, you can also just share with your cat, because your cat might tell another cat, and that cat might be the leader of a cat gang. And who knows, we might just become the #1 listened podcast of cool cats. And everyone wants to be a cool cat. So thanks so much for listening. We can't wait to catch you next time as we unravel the mysteries of folklore.